This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. Clearwater Middle School sat tucked behind rows of towering pine trees, its modest brick facade blending seamlessly with the serene suburban sprawl of Florida. The campus, surrounded by well-manicured lawns and tidy sidewalks, seemed an emblem of safety, the kind of place where parents trusted their children to thrive. But inside the walls of this otherwise unremarkable school, Harmony Green walked with her head bowed, her presence nearly invisible to her peers. Her small frame seemed to shrink under the weight of her oversized backpack, and her hazel eyes, flecked with gold, rarely met anyone's gaze. To most, she was just another quiet, unremarkable child navigating the turbulent waters of middle school. Harmony's silence masked a deep reservoir of thoughts, fears, and frustrations. Unlike her peers, who chatted in clusters or giggled at memes on their phones during recess, Harmony spent her time hunched over notebooks, her small hands scribbling furiously. She loved to read, though her choices skewed toward the macabre. In the school library, where rows of books sat untouched by her classmates, she gravitated toward stories of true crime, survival, and revenge. The older librarian, Mrs. Simmons, thought nothing of the peculiar selections Harmony made. After all, children often indulged in curiosities. What harm could come from a child reading about poisonings in Victorian England or meticulously researched accounts of criminal investigations? Mrs. Simmons simply smiled and stamped the books, unaware of the weight her actions carried. At home, Harmony's life was equally unremarkable on the surface. She lived in a modest single-story house with her mother, Karen, who worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. Karen was a kind woman, but her exhaustion often left little room for meaningful connection with her daughter. She trusted Harmony to take care of herself, never questioning why the little girl spent so many hours alone in her room. The room itself was a shrine to Harmony's inner world. The bookshelves groaned under the weight of crime novels, encyclopedias, and scientific texts, while her desk was littered with notebooks, drawings, and carefully labeled containers of household chemicals. Karen chalked it up to her daughter's eccentricities. "She's just a smart kid," she would tell her coworkers when asked about Harmony's solitary nature. Always reading or experimenting. What Karen and the school didn't see, however, was the growing darkness that festered in Harmony's mind. At school, she was a target, a punching bag for children who sensed her difference and preyed upon it. The taunts started small snide comments about her second-hand clothes, the way her hair frizzed in Florida's humid air, or the fact that she always seemed to eat the same peanut butter sandwich for lunch. Over time, the bullying escalated. By the 5th grade, Harmony had become a social pariah. Her classmates whispered cruel rumors about her, calling her Harmony Grim and accusing her of practicing witchcraft. It didn't help that the teacher, Mr. Langston, a wiry man with graying hair, often turned a blind eye to the taunting. On bad days, he even joined in, using her as the butt of jokes to elicit laughter from the class. The worst days were the ones where the bullying turned physical. A shove in the hallway, a backpack emptied onto the floor, or her desk mysteriously covered in sticky soda. These were the moments that seared into Harmony's memory. She never fought back, never raised her voice. Instead, she absorbed the blows in silence, her face a blank mask. Inside, though, a storm brewed. Harmony began to catalog every slight, every insult, every betrayal, etching them into the pages of her diary. At first, the entries were simple venting. "Today, Jessica poured glue on my chair." Everyone laughed, but as time went on, the diary transformed into something darker, a blueprint for her mounting rage. Harmony's fascination with the mechanics of harm began innocently enough. One day, after a particularly humiliating incident in which her lunch tray was flipped onto her lap, she found herself idly searching the internet for ways to make people sick without hurting them. What started as a curious deflection spiraled into an obsession. She discovered forums, obscure articles, and even YouTube videos detailing the effects of various chemicals and substances. Most of the information was harmless, pseudoscientific ramblings posted by hobbyists, but Harmony's sharp mind sifted through the nonsense for kernels of truth. She began conducting small experiments, mixing household cleaners to see what would fizz, bubble, or change color. The results thrilled her, not because of their destructive potential, but because they represented control, something she lacked in every other aspect of her life. The first time Harmony considered the possibility of retaliation was during a mandatory science class safety video. The narrator warned against mixing certain chemicals in the classroom, describing how dangerous reactions could occur if mishandled. Harmony's mind wandered, piecing together the narrator's words with the fragments of knowledge she had gathered from her experiments. What if she could turn these lessons into something more? Not just a defense mechanism, but a way to make the people who hurt her truly understand what it felt like to be powerless. By the time Harmony entered the 6th grade, her thoughts had grown darker, more intricate. The bullying hadn't stopped, in fact, it had intensified. Her classmates grew bolder, more creative in their cruelty. Her teacher's indifference hardened into open contempt. Harmony began to feel as though she were a ghost, floating unseen through the hallways, her existence acknowledged only when someone wanted to hurt her. It was during this time that she started to write detailed plans in her diary. These were not impulsive scribblings but carefully thought-out scenarios. She envisioned how she could alter the environment of the school to strike back without anyone suspecting her. The plan started small. Spiking a bully's water bottle was something that would make them sick for a day, but soon escalated into fantasies of larger, more dramatic acts. Harmony's descent into this chilling state of mind was imperceptible to those around her. To her mother, she was just a quirky kid who loved science. To her teacher, she was a quiet student who rarely caused trouble. To her classmates, she was a convenient target, someone they could torment without fear of consequences. But Harmony was none of those things. She was a child simmering with rage, honing her skills, and waiting for the moment when she could turn the tables on a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. The tipping point came on a bright spring morning, the kind of day that seemed to mock Harmony Green's internal darkness. Clearwater Middle School was alive with chatter and movement as students hurried to their classes, their laughter echoing through the corridors. Harmony, as always, walked alone, her pace brisk, her eyes fixed on the worn linoleum floor. She carried her books pressed tightly against her chest, as if shielding herself from an onslaught. That morning, however, the taunts began earlier than usual. A group of girls, Jessica, Amanda, and 2 others Harmony never bothered to name in her mind, trailed behind her, their voices loud and pointed. The words blurred together, a mix of cruel nicknames and accusations of being weird or creepy. Harmony quickened her pace, her heart hammering in her chest, but the girls followed her all the way to class. When she arrived, she found her desk moved to the corner of the room, pushed against the wall like an afterthought. This was not unusual. Her classmates often rearranged the seating when the teacher was out of the room, a petty act designed to isolate her. She quietly slid into her seat, ignoring the muffled giggles from across the room. Mr. Langston walked in moments later, carrying a stack of papers. He didn't even glance in her direction. The class began as usual, but Harmony's mind wandered, her focus slipping in and out of the monotonous drone of the lesson. The sense of being trapped, of having no control over her surroundings, pressed down on her like a suffocating weight. The incident that followed was both cruel and absurdly simple. During a group activity, Harmony was paired with 2 boys, Ethan and Kyle, who were known for their disruptive behavior. As the group worked, or rather, as Harmony tried to complete the assignment, while the boys joked around, Ethan leaned over and dumped the contents of his water bottle into Harmony's backpack. The water seeped through the fabric, soaking her notebooks, her library book, and the carefully labeled jars of household chemicals she had been studying in secret. Harmony froze, her breath catching as she felt the water pool at her feet. Laughter erupted around her, loud and unrestrained. Even Mr. Langston, when he noticed, simply chuckled and said, "Boys," cut it out before returning to his desk. That moment marked a shift in Harmony. As she stared at the ruined contents of her backpack, her mind began to race, not with panic or sadness, but with cold, calculated thoughts. She didn't cry, didn't protest. Instead, she meticulously gathered her belongings, squeezing the water from her notebooks and silently noting the laughter still ringing in her ears. The humiliation, the injustice, it all burned, but not in a way that would fizzle out with time. It burned in a way that solidified her resolve. When the bell rang, she walked out of the classroom with a strange sense of clarity, her hands clenched into fists so tight her nails dug into her palms. The day didn't improve. During lunch, Harmony found her usual spot in the corner of the cafeteria, only to discover that her seat had been taken by Jessica and her friends. They sneered at her as she approached, their voices dripping with mockery. "Find another seat," one of them said, gesturing to the crowded room. Harmony didn't respond. She simply turned and left, heading outside to eat her soggy peanut butter sandwich on the steps near the playground. It was here, under the unrelenting Florida sun, that the idea began to take shape. She thought about the water, the laughter, the teacher's indifference. Her mind replayed the scene over and over, each iteration sharpening her focus. This wasn't just about the backpack or the ruined books. It was about power, who had it and who didn't. That night, Harmony locked herself in her room, her movements precise and deliberate. She laid out her ruined belongings, examining each piece with the detached curiosity of a scientist. Her library book, a detailed account of chemical reactions, was warped and unreadable. Her notebooks, filled with sketches and formulas, were smudged and torn. She salvaged what she could, setting aside the pages that remained legible. Then she turned to her diary. Flipping to a blank page, she began to write, her pen carving deep grooves into the paper. This entry was different from the others. It wasn't a recounting of events or a litany of complaints. It was a plan, a carefully outlined series of steps that would ensure she was never humiliated again. Over the next few weeks, Harmony threw herself into her studies with renewed determination. She spent hours in the library, poring over books on chemistry, biology, and physics. Her internet searches grew more specific, her methods more sophisticated. She learned about toxins, reactions, and delivery mechanisms, compiling her findings into a thick notebook hidden beneath her bed. At school, she maintained her usual facade of quiet invisibility, her expression blank and unreadable. Her classmates continued their torment, oblivious to the transformation happening right in front of them. Harmony had become a predator in waiting, her every move calculated, her every thought focused on the endgame. The catalyst came in the form of the annual science fair. Announced with great fanfare by Mr. Langston, it was framed as an opportunity for students to showcase their creativity and intelligence. For Harmony, it was the perfect stage. The fair would take place in the gymnasium, a sprawling space filled with tables and displays. Students were encouraged to present experiments, models, or research projects, and the entire school would be in attendance. Harmony's classmates, predictably, mocked her when she announced her participation. "What are you going to do? Show us how to make a volcano explode," one of them sneered. Harmony didn't respond. She simply smiled, a small, unsettling curve of her lips that made even the boldest bully hesitate. The weeks leading up to the fair were a blur of activity. Harmony spent her evenings refining her project, a deceptively simple display on the effects of common household chemicals. She practiced her presentation in front of a mirror, her voice steady and emotionless. She made lists, checked them twice, and ensured every detail was accounted for. Her plan was bold, risky, and devastatingly effective. By the time the science fair arrived, Harmony was ready. What began as a quiet act of defiance had evolved into something far more dangerous, a meticulously orchestrated plot that would change Clearwater Middle School forever. Harmony's transformation was complete. The shy, quiet girl who had once cowered under the weight of her classmates' cruelty was gone, replaced by someone colder, more calculating. She moved through the halls with a newfound confidence, her eyes sharp and unyielding. The events of that spring morning had set her on a path from which there was no turning back, a path that would lead to an act so horrifying it would haunt the town for years to come. The stage was set, the players unwittingly in place, and Harmony was ready to deliver her final lesson. Harmony Green's plan began to take shape with the precision of an architect drafting blueprints. Each detail was carefully considered, each step executed with a level of focus and determination far beyond her years. The science fair, scheduled for a Friday afternoon, provided the ideal setting. It would bring together students, teachers, and parents in one space, their attention divided among the various displays and experiments. To Harmony, the fair was more than an academic exercise, it was an opportunity to control the narrative, to wield the power she had been denied for so long. Her plan relied on two key elements: concealment and precision. She had spent months studying the science of chemical reactions, focusing specifically on substances that could be obtained without raising suspicion. Her research led her to a combination of common chemicals easy to source, yet volatile when combined in the right conditions. These substances, she discovered, could release fumes strong enough to incapacitate those in a confined space. The idea intrigued her not because of its destructive potential, but because of its elegance. It was silent, invisible, and devastatingly effective. Acquiring the materials was easier than she anticipated. She began with the basics: bleach, ammonia, and a handful of other household cleaners she had seen in online tutorials. Her trips to local stores were careful and staggered. She purchased one item at a time, visiting different locations to avoid drawing attention. She paid in cash, her small frame and unassuming demeanor ensuring she was never questioned. At home, she stored the materials in a cardboard box hidden beneath her bed, each item labeled and cataloged in her notebook. Her meticulous nature ensured there were no mistakes. She double-checked every label, every measurement, rehearsing the steps in her mind until she could recite them perfectly. The next phase of her plan involved the construction of her display. She chose a simple topic that would draw minimal scrutiny: the effects of household chemicals on different surfaces. The project was innocuous, even dull, designed to blend into the sea of other exhibits. She built a small wooden stand to hold her materials, carefully painting it with a cheerful blue and yellow pattern to match the fair's theme. On the surface, it appeared harmless plastic containers filled with water and vinegar, a few common cleaning products and strips of fabric and metal for demonstration purposes. Beneath the surface, however, Harmony had embedded a system of hidden compartments and tubing, allowing her to release the chemicals with the push of a button. The mechanics of the setup were deceptively simple. Harmony had scavenged parts from old toys and electronics, fashioning a rudimentary pump system that could mix and release the chemicals on command. She tested it repeatedly in the privacy of her room, using small amounts of harmless substances to simulate the reaction. Each trial brought her closer to perfection, her confidence growing with every success. She documented her progress in her notebook, writing in a code of her own invention a series of symbols and abbreviations that only she could decipher. This layer of secrecy gave her a sense of control, a reassurance that her plan would remain hers alone until the moment she chose to reveal it. As the science fair approached, Harmony began to rehearse her performance. She knew that the key to her plan's success lay in her ability to maintain her composure. Any hint of nervousness or hesitation could draw unwanted attention, jeopardizing everything she had worked for. She practiced speaking in front of the mirror, her voice steady and measured, her expression neutral. In her mind, she imagined the reactions of her audience, the polite nods of parents, the bored indifference of teachers, the mocking glances of her classmates. None of it mattered. By the time they realized what was happening, it would be too late. The final days before the fair were a blur of preparation. Harmony spent hours refining her display, ensuring every detail was flawless. She printed neat labels for her jars and containers, typed up an explanation of her project, and even prepared a small handout for visitors. These touches, she knew, would further divert suspicion, painting her as a diligent student, rather than the mastermind of a carefully orchestrated plan. At night, she lay awake in bed, her mind racing with thoughts of the coming day. She felt no fear, no doubt. Instead, she was consumed by a cold, unshakable determination. The morning of the science fair arrived with an air of excitement that seemed almost mocking to Harmony. The school buzzed with activity as students set up their displays, the gymnasium filling with the hum of conversation and the clatter of equipment. Harmony worked methodically, arranging her materials with the precision of a surgeon. She wore a simple outfit, jeans and a plain white shirt chosen deliberately to blend in. Her hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, her face expressionless. As she worked, she listened to the chatter around her, the voices of her classmates rising and falling like waves. None of them paid her any attention, their focus fixed on their own projects. It was exactly as she had planned. As the fair began, Harmony positioned herself behind her display, her hands clasped lightly in front of her. She watched as parents and teachers wandered from table to table, their faces lit with polite interest. Occasionally, someone would stop at her exhibit, glancing at the neatly arranged materials and the cheerful sign she had made. Harmony greeted them with a practiced smile, explaining her project in a calm, measured tone. To all appearances, she was just another student eager to share her work. But Harmony's mind was elsewhere. She watched the gymnasium fill, noting the placement of the exits, the flow of movement, the clusters of people gathered around the most popular exhibits. She mentally calculated the timing, waiting for the moment when the room would be at its fullest. Her hand hovered near the hidden button beneath her table, her fingers brushing against its smooth surface. The weight of her plan settled over her, heavy and unyielding, but she felt no urge to stop. She had come too far, and the thought of turning back now was unthinkable. The crowd thickened, the noise rising to a deafening crescendo. Harmony's pulse quickened, not with fear, but with anticipation. She glanced around one final time, her eyes scanning the room. Everything was in place. The moment had arrived. Harmony took a deep breath, steadying herself. Her fingers tightened around the button, her heart pounding in her chest. She closed her eyes, counting silently to 3. Then, with a deliberate motion, she pressed down. In that instant, Harmony Green unleashed the culmination of months of planning, the invisible threads of her scheme weaving together in a single devastating act. The world around her seemed to slow, the sounds of the gymnasium fading into a distant hum. She opened her eyes, her expression unreadable, and waited for the chaos to unfold. The moment Harmony pressed the hidden button beneath her science fair display, the sequence of events she had orchestrated with chilling precision began to unfold. Beneath the cheerful blue and yellow stand, her hidden apparatus came to life. The small pump, rigged together from salvaged electronics, whirred almost imperceptibly, releasing a controlled mixture of chemicals into the concealed tubing. From there, the volatile cocktail was dispersed in a fine, invisible mist into the crowded gymnasium. At first, there was no immediate reaction. The fair continued as if nothing had changed, the hum of voices rising and falling, punctuated by bursts of laughter and the occasional clatter of a dropped object. Harmony stood motionless, her expression calm, her eyes scanning the room. She noted the subtle changes as the invisible mist began to take effect. A parent near the center of the room paused mid-conversation, his hand going to his throat as if to adjust a tight collar. A student at the far end of the gym rubbed her eyes vigorously, her face contorted in confusion. The reaction spread like ripples in a pond, subtle at first but growing in intensity with each passing second. The chemicals Harmony had chosen were not immediately lethal. That was by design. Her intention was not a sudden, dramatic explosion but a creeping, suffocating wave of panic that would spread through the room like a silent predator. The mist, when inhaled, caused a range of symptoms: burning eyes, difficulty breathing, dizziness, and nausea. Harmony had calculated the doses carefully, ensuring they would incapacitate without killing outright, at least, not immediately. She wanted them to suffer, to experience the helplessness she had felt every day of her life. The first cries of distress cut through the general chatter like shards of glass. A mother holding her toddler stumbled, clutching her chest as she gasped for air. A group of students near the snack table began to cough violently, their laughter turning to panic as their throats tightened and their vision blurred. Teachers moved toward the affected students, their faces etched with concern, but they too began to falter, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated. Within minutes, the gymnasium descended into chaos. The noise was deafening. People screamed, shouted for help, knocked over tables in their desperation to escape. The once orderly rows of exhibits became a battlefield, displays crashing to the floor, scattering papers, glass, and plastic across the polished wood. The air grew thick with the acrid stench of the chemicals, mingling with the sweat and fear of the crowd. Parents clutched their children, trying to shield them from the invisible threat, while students tripped over each other in their frantic rush to the exits. But the doors, as Harmony had anticipated, became bottlenecks, the panicked mob jamming together in their desperate attempt to flee. The room, so expansive and open just moments before, now felt like a suffocating cage. Harmony stood amidst the chaos, an unmoving figure in a storm of terror. Her small stature and unassuming presence allowed her to remain unnoticed, even as the people around her collapsed or fled. Her heart beat steadily, her breathing calm. She felt detached from the scene, as though watching it unfold through a pane of glass. This was not revenge in the heat of the moment, not a spontaneous outburst of rage. This was her symphony, meticulously composed and executed with the precision of a conductor guiding an orchestra. The effects of the chemicals varied depending on proximity to the source. Those closest to Harmony's display were hit the hardest, their symptoms appearing almost immediately. A teacher collapsed to her knees, clutching her throat as her eyes streamed with tears. A group of students nearby clung to each other, their faces pale and glistening with sweat, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Farther from the epicenter, the reactions were slower, less severe but no less frightening. Parents and teachers stumbled as dizziness overtook them, their legs buckling beneath their weight. The chaos was compounded by the panic itself, people tripping, colliding and pushing in their desperate attempts to escape, unaware that the exits were already overwhelmed. As the minutes dragged on, the gymnasium transformed into a scene of pure horror. The polished wood floor was littered with overturned tables, crushed displays, and abandoned belongings. The air was thick with the choking stench of chemicals and the cries of the afflicted. A girl Harmony recognized as one of her tormentors lay sprawled on the floor, her hands clawing at her throat, her face contorted in agony. Nearby, a teacher tried to drag himself toward the doors, his limbs trembling, his breath rasping in his chest. The sight should have been overwhelming, but Harmony felt nothing. She was an observer, detached and clinical, her emotions locked away in some unreachable corner of her mind. The chaos spilled out into the hallways as those who managed to escape the gym spread the panic to the rest of the school. Students and staff in nearby classrooms peered out, their faces pale with confusion and fear. The fire alarm blared, its shrill tone adding to the cacophony, but it only served to heighten the sense of urgency. Emergency protocols were abandoned as teachers and students fled in every direction, their only thought to get as far away from the source of the horror as possible. In the gymnasium, the scene grew quieter as the effects of the chemicals took their toll. Many of the victims lay motionless on the floor, their breathing shallow, their bodies racked with convulsions. Others remained conscious but incapacitated, their cries reduced to weak whimpers. The room, once filled with the sounds of life and laughter, now echoed with the hollow, fragmented remnants of human suffering. Harmony finally moved. She walked slowly through the wreckage, her steps deliberate, her eyes scanning the devastation. Her hands hung loosely at her sides, her fingers brushing against the fabric of her jeans. She felt no satisfaction, no triumph. This was not about winning or losing. This was about balance, restoring a sense of control in a world that had denied her agency. She paused near the center of the gym, her gaze falling on a table that had been knocked over in the chaos. The bright banner that once adorned it lay crumpled on the floor, its cheerful lettering smeared with dirt and spilled drinks. Harmony tilted her head, studying the scene with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining a failed experiment. Outside, the wail of sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of first responders. Harmony had anticipated this as well. She knew it was only a matter of time before the authorities descended on the school, their flashing lights and shouted commands cutting through the chaos. She welcomed their arrival. It was the final act in her carefully constructed narrative, the moment when the outside world would be forced to confront what had happened. She didn't plan to hide or run. There was no need. The story would tell itself, the pieces falling into place as the investigators unraveled the truth. Harmony turned toward the doors, her movements unhurried, her face expressionless. She knew her role in the aftermath was already written, her part in the story secured. As she walked through the wreckage, her small figure barely visible amidst the devastation, she felt a strange sense of calm. The storm she had unleashed was unstoppable, its consequences rippling outward like waves in a vast, uncharted sea. The investigation into the Clearwater Middle School tragedy began under the harsh glare of media scrutiny and the anguished cries of a grieving community. The once quiet suburban town was transformed overnight into a hub of activity, its streets clogged with news vans, police vehicles, and emergency personnel. The school, a place that had symbolized safety and routine for so many, was now a crime scene, its gymnasium cordoned off with yellow tape and guarded by uniformed officers. Forensic teams in white protective suits moved methodically through the wreckage, their faces hidden behind masks, their gloved hands collecting samples and documenting the devastation. The initial chaos was overwhelming. Emergency responders had been met with a scene of unimaginable horror. Dozens of students, teachers, and parents collapsed across the gymnasium floor, many unconscious, others barely clinging to life. The acrid stench of chemicals lingered in the air, forcing responders to don respirators as they worked to evacuate the survivors. Ambulances lined the parking lot, their sirens wailing as paramedics ferried victims to nearby hospitals. The local fire department deployed large fans to ventilate the building, dispersing the lingering fumes that had already claimed so many. In the hours that followed, law enforcement officials struggled to piece together what had happened. At first, there was speculation that the incident was a tragic accident, a chemical spill caused by a mishap during the science fair. The theory seemed plausible given the setting, and initial witness statements were fragmented and contradictory, reflecting the confusion and panic that had gripped the crowd. But as the investigation progressed, the evidence began to suggest something far more sinister. The turning point came when detectives examined the source of the chemical release. Forensic analysis revealed that the mixture had not occurred accidentally, it had been deliberately engineered. The chemicals, while common and easy to obtain, had been combined in precise proportions to maximize their effects. Investigators found traces of tubing and a rudimentary pump system hidden within the debris of one of the science fair displays. The discovery was chilling. It pointed to a level of planning and intent that went far beyond a simple accident. Attention quickly shifted to identifying the person responsible. The forensic team meticulously reconstructed the scene, using photographs, witness accounts, and physical evidence to trace the origin of the chemical release. Their efforts converged on a single exhibit, a display that had appeared, on the surface, to be an innocent exploration of household chemicals. The stand, painted in cheerful colors and adorned with neatly labeled containers, had gone unnoticed in the chaos of the fair. But the hidden apparatus beneath it told a different story. As detectives examined the display's remains, they uncovered a small notebook tucked into a compartment at the base of the stand. The notebook, though water-damaged and partially illegible, contained pages of notes written in a meticulous hand. The entries were a mix of chemical formulas, diagrams, and what appeared to be coded instructions. It was clear that the notebook belonged to someone with a deep understanding of chemistry and an unsettling level of foresight. The breakthrough came when a forensic handwriting analyst compared the notebook entries to school records. The match was undeniable. The handwriting belonged to Harmony Green, a 10-year-old sixth grader known for her quiet demeanor and academic diligence. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigative team. The idea that such a devastating act could have been orchestrated by a child defied belief, but the evidence was irrefutable. Harmony's name was added to the list of suspects, and detectives began to piece together a profile of the girl who had turned her school into a scene of carnage. Interviews with Harmony's teachers, classmates, and neighbors painted a picture of a bright but socially isolated child. Her classmates described her as weird and creepy, noting her obsession with books about crime and science. Teachers recalled her as quiet and unobtrusive, a student who rarely caused trouble but never seemed to connect with her peers. Her mother, Karen Green, provided additional insight, describing Harmony as a curious and independent child who spent most of her time alone in her room. Karen admitted that she had noticed Harmony's growing interest in chemistry but had dismissed it as a harmless hobby. The more investigators dug into Harmony's life, the more disturbing details emerged. The search of her bedroom yielded a treasure trove of evidence: shelves filled with books on chemical reactions and forensic science, notebooks brimming with detailed plans and coded entries, and a cardboard box containing unused supplies identical to those found at the crime scene. The meticulous nature of her preparations left no doubt this was not the impulsive act of an angry child, but a calculated attack planned over months. Harmony herself was taken into custody without resistance. She had remained at the school in the aftermath of the attack, her small figure blending into the crowd of survivors and first responders. When officers approached her, she offered no protest, her expression blank and unreadable. She was escorted to the police station, where she was placed in a small, sterile interrogation room. Her silence was unnerving. She neither cried nor asked for her mother. Instead, she sat motionless, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the table in front of her. The interrogation was a delicate process. Harmony's age complicated matters, raising questions about her understanding of her actions and her capacity to stand trial. A child psychologist was brought in to evaluate her, but even they struggled to penetrate Harmony's calm exterior. She spoke only when prompted, her answers short and matter-of-fact. When asked about the events of the science fair, she described them with clinical detachment, as though recounting an experiment from a textbook. There was no remorse, no anger, no emotion of any kind. It was this lack of feeling that unsettled investigators the most. As the case unfolded, the media descended on Clearwater, turning the tragedy into a national spectacle. Headlines screamed of a child mastermind and a little girl with a deadly plan. Pundits debated the societal factors that could lead a child to commit such an act, pointing to everything from bullying to mental illness to the influence of violent media. The town itself became a microcosm of grief and outrage. Parents demanded answers, teachers faced scrutiny, and students struggled to process the loss of their friends and the betrayal by one of their own. The investigation revealed the extent of Harmony's isolation and the relentless bullying she had endured. Her diary, a spiral-bound book found tucked beneath her bed, provided a haunting glimpse into her mind. The entries, written in neat, looping script, chronicled years of torment at the hands of her classmates and the indifference of her teachers. They also revealed the moment she decided to take control, her plans unfolding across the pages with chilling precision. The diary became a key piece of evidence, offering a roadmap of her descent into darkness. In the end, the case raised more questions than it answered. Harmony's actions were unprecedented, her motives both disturbingly clear and deeply complex. She had acted out of pain, anger, and a desire for control, yet the sheer scale and precision of her attack suggested a mind capable of cold, calculated violence. The investigation closed with Harmony's confession, but the scars it left on Clearwater were far from healed. The town, once a quiet haven, would forever be defined by the events of that spring day, its name synonymous with a tragedy that defied understanding. The aftermath of the Clearwater Middle School tragedy unfolded like the slow unraveling of a thread, each day pulling the town further into the depths of shock, grief, and unanswered questions. The once peaceful community found itself engulfed by an overwhelming tide of media coverage, public outrage, and internal division. The gymnasium, where so many lives had been shattered, remained sealed off for weeks, its entrance guarded by police as forensic teams worked tirelessly to document every inch of the scene. The yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the humid Florida breeze, a haunting reminder of the horrors that had unfolded within. The victims became the center of the town's grief. 15 children and one teacher had lost their lives, each death sparking waves of mourning that rippled through families, friends, and neighborhoods. At the hospital, where the surviving victims were treated, Doctors battled to save those who had suffered severe chemical exposure. Some remained in critical condition for days, their lungs scarred, their bodies weakened. Others, though conscious, bore the emotional scars of the event, eyes wide with fear, hands trembling uncontrollably, unable to speak of what they had endured. Funerals became a near daily occurrence, the steady procession of black-clad mourners winding through the streets to the town's small cemetery. Each service brought a fresh wave of sorrow, as eulogies described the bright futures stolen by the attack. Teachers wept openly, parents clutched each other in disbelief, and classmates sat silently, their faces pale and drawn. The graves, marked by simple headstones and mounds of fresh earth, became a painful symbol of the community's loss. In the schools, the effects were equally profound. Clearwater Middle School shut down indefinitely, its halls silent and empty. Parents refused to send their children back, demanding assurances that the building was safe and that such an atrocity could never happen again. The school district scrambled to relocate students to other facilities, but the shadow of the attack loomed large over every classroom, every desk. Students, once carefree and full of youthful exuberance, now sat quietly, their eyes darting nervously at the slightest sound. Teachers struggled to provide comfort, their voices wavering as they reassured children who no longer felt secure in a place meant to nurture and protect them. The community's attention turned quickly to the girl at the center of it all, Harmony Green. The revelation that a 10-year-old child had masterminded such a calculated attack sent shockwaves not only through Clearwater but across the nation. Harmony's mugshot, her small face framed by her dark, unkempt hair, became a grim icon of the tragedy. Her expression was eerily blank, devoid of fear or remorse, a stark contrast to the monstrous nature of her actions. News outlets ran endless segments dissecting her life, her motives, and the psychological profile of a child capable of such violence. The courtroom proceedings that followed were unlike anything the state of Florida had ever seen. The legal system struggled to reconcile Harmony's age with the severity of her crime. Public opinion was sharply divided. Some demanded the harshest punishment possible, viewing her as a monster in a child's body. Others argued that she was a product of her environment, a deeply damaged victim who needed rehabilitation, not retribution. Child psychologists and criminal experts debated her case on television, their discussions laced with a mix of fascination and horror. In the courtroom, the evidence against Harmony was overwhelming. Prosecutors presented her notebook, her diary, and the carefully constructed apparatus that had dispersed the chemicals in the gymnasium. Witnesses testified to her solitary nature, her obsession with crime and science, and the relentless bullying she had endured. But it was Harmony's own words, recorded in her diary, that left the courtroom in stunned silence. The entries were read aloud, revealing a mind that had meticulously cataloged every slight, every act of cruelty, and transformed that pain into a cold, calculated plan for revenge. Harmony herself remained an enigma throughout the trial. She sat quietly at the defense table, her small frame dwarfed by the towering presence of her lawyers. Her face betrayed no emotion as the charges were read, as witnesses recounted the chaos of the science fair, or as grieving parents described the loss of their children. Even when the prosecutor displayed photos of the victims' bright, smiling faces now reduced to memories, Harmony's expression remained unchanged. To many, her composure was as chilling as her crime. The trial's conclusion was as controversial as the case itself. The judge, weighing Harmony's age and the unprecedented nature of her actions, handed down a sentence that sought to balance punishment with the possibility of rehabilitation. She was committed to a high-security juvenile detention facility, where she would undergo intensive psychological evaluation and treatment. The decision satisfied few. Some saw it as too lenient, a slap on the wrist for an act of mass murder. Others believed it was cruel to lock away a child whose actions, while horrific, stemmed from years of neglect and abuse. As Harmony began her sentence, the town of Clearwater struggled to move forward, but the healing process was fraught with challenges. Parents demanded answers from the school board, blaming administrators and teachers for failing to protect their children. Lawsuits were filed, accusing the district of negligence for allowing the bullying that had fueled Harmony's rage. Mr. Langston, the teacher who had ignored her torment and even participated in mocking her, resigned in disgrace, his reputation irreparably damaged. The tragedy also ignited a national conversation about bullying, mental health, and the accessibility of dangerous information online. Advocacy groups called for stricter regulations on internet content, better training for teachers to recognize signs of distress in students, and increased funding for school counselors. Politicians used the tragedy to push their agendas, some focusing on juvenile justice reform, others on school safety measures. But for all the talk and debate, the people of Clearwater were left to face the raw, unfiltered reality of their pain. For Harmony's mother, Karen Green, the weight of the tragedy was unbearable. She became a pariah in the community, her every move scrutinized and criticized. People whispered about her parenting, blaming her for not seeing the signs, for not stopping her daughter before it was too late. Karen retreated into isolation, her once bustling home now silent and empty. She kept the lights dim, the curtains drawn, and avoided the gazes of neighbors when she ventured outside. The guilt consumed her, a constant, gnawing ache that left her hollow. Over time, the immediate shock of the tragedy began to fade, replaced by a quiet, pervasive grief that settled over Clearwater like a heavy fog. The gymnasium was eventually reopened, though few could bear to step inside. A memorial was erected in front of the school, its polished stone surface etched with the names of the victims. Flowers, candles, and handwritten notes were left at its base, a testament to the lives lost and the scars left behind. But even as the town tried to heal, the specter of Harmony Green loomed large. Her name became a cautionary tale, whispered in hushed tones by parents warning their children about the consequences of cruelty. For those who had known her, she was a reminder of the fragility of innocence, the darkness that could grow unchecked in the absence of kindness and understanding. And for Harmony herself, locked away in a sterile facility, the world outside became a distant memory, a place where her name would forever be synonymous with tragedy.